Hi, Sarah. I'm so honored to have you here. I really admire the work you're doing, and I love learning from mentors who are a few steps ahead of me on the journey. And to start, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, your family, and the peaceful parenting approach you use and teach?
Sure. I am the mom of three kids who are, I don't even know what to call them because they're not really kids anymore. My youngest is 17, she's still at home, and my sons are 20 and 24, and both of them live on their own, are independent. And I raised them with peaceful parenting. I started doing it when my oldest son was born, grew out of what I knew about attachment parenting, and that was just starting to come to the forefront. And I really felt a disconnect between everything that I was creating in terms of our bond and our connection through really just focusing on that through what traditional discipline was. And all of a sudden, I had people telling me, oh, don't pick him up when he cries. He's just trying to manipulate you. And it just felt so wrong to me. And I am lucky that I was blessed with an inordinate amount of not caring what other people think. Not there are some things, of course, that I care what other people think, but I felt confident enough in what I was doing, even without there were no books, or there wasn't really any information out there around peaceful parenting. But I just started doing it, and I really found that there was one author, Alfie Kohn, who was writing about. Do you know Alfie Kohn? You know
Yeah,
his
I do.
yeah, early voyager in the peaceful parenting space, talking about parenting without punishment. And so I just found what I could and put it together and just did it. And then when my youngest child went to kindergarten, the career that I had before I had kids wasn't suitable anymore as a mother. The hours were really long. Even though I really liked the job, I knew that I didn't want to go back to working 60-hour weeks. So I decided to start my own business as a parenting coach. And that was about a dozen, 12 years ago or something. And since then, I've done a training with trained with Dr. Laura Markham of AHA Parenting. I think she's changed the name now, but trained with her. I've done a ton of other trainings and just really learned as I went, as I've been coaching parents. And I think you also wanted me to talk about the peaceful parenting approach. The first pillar of peaceful parenting is parental self regulation. So that doesn't mean that you never get upset or frustrated, but it means that you try to recognize when you are getting upset or frustrated so that you don't, nobody's perfect. So, of course, we're not expecting perfection, but we try not to yell or worse. And so, really, that focus on our own triggers and our own feelings and trying to get in touch with them and calm ourselves. Really, it's there's so many reasons not to yell, and one of them is just because it scares kids and it hurts our relationship. But also, just more practically, it's really hard to be effective when you are dysregulated, right? Say you wanted to know some strategies for getting out the door in the morning without fighting with your child. I could tell you a whole bunch of strategies, but if you're not calm enough to be able to access the strategies, then they're
Right,
useless, right? So we
right.
really want to think about how can we try to stay calm, especially when our child is also maybe dysregulated, so that we can be more effective, so that we can have a better relationship, and also so that our child can co-regulate with us, which basically is like our nervous system, our calm-ish nervous system, calmer nervous system can be an anchor for our child for them to use that to calm themselves down. So that's the first big idea.
And one
Um,
thing that really stood out to me when I read your emails from this course was the idea that there is always a deeper, more vulnerable emotion underneath anger. I would like to
yeah,
dive
so
deeper.
anger is actually a secondary emotion. So we always think our child does this thing and then we get angry. Anger is a the fight response that's a protective response to the more vulnerable feeling underneath. So a great example is somebody says something that really hurts your feelings, your first response, and it might even be so quick you don't even notice it, but your first response is hurt. That hurts. But your next response might be, I can't believe you said that. The nerve of you. You might get angry in response to somebody hurting your feelings. But the anger is the our body's fight, flight, or freeze response to that feeling of emotional overwhelm, or that it's an emergency. They hurt my feelings, and then our body unconsciously we launch that fight, flight, or freeze response. Or, for example, you're in the grocery store and your child's having a meltdown on the floor, and you might get angry at your child, but the root of the anger is actually that you're embarrassed or you're ashamed or you feel like a bad parent. And so then those more tender feelings are actually what causes that secondary response of anger. And that's why we spend so much time in the course looking at the triggers underneath the anger, because they're different for everybody. Like we just said that that example in the grocery store, a person might be embarrassed, another person might be afraid of the same behavior, and this and having the same response would happen in terms of an angry response, right? So every person's own individual life experiences inform what their triggers are. I can't tell you how many times I've been coaching parents and they've said after 2 or 3 sessions, they're like, this isn't even about my kid. This is all about me.
Yeah.
So it's not our child's action that causes our response. It's our feelings or thoughts or fears about that action. And also there might be people who could not care less if their child is crying on the floor of the grocery store, but they'd get really upset if their child was ignoring them, right? Those triggers are so individual. And so really that's the first big idea of peaceful parenting, is really working on getting to know our triggers, getting to figure out ways to calm ourselves. And there are lots of great mantras that I suggest that you find one that's meaningful for you in that moment. And you stop, drop, and breathe. Use your pause button, stop what you're doing, drop your agenda just for a minute, and then just breathe. Because breathing is a signal to your body that it's not an emergency. And then you can tell yourself something like, this is not an emergency, or my loyalty is to my child, or they're not giving me a hard time, they're having a hard time, something like that, some sort of mantra to help you get back on track.
Yeah, and also love the idea that you can find better ways to physically release the stress and this energy instead of scaring the
Mm-hmm.
kids because you
Yeah,
feel better after yelling and
100%.
yeah.
You feel better and then worse again.
And then worse again.
Yeah,
Yeah, of course.
because the yelling really releases some of that fight, flight, or freeze energy. Just like out in the wild, if you were scared and you ran away from a tiger, but running away would release that fight, flight, or freeze energy. So finding other ways, I just mentioned breathing, but there are lots of other ways that people can do instead of yelling to release the energy.
Yeah, I like the physical ones like shaking or
Hmm.
just moving around because
Yeah,
it really moves the energy. That's the thing.
yeah,
And you mentioned the second
yeah.
pillar.
So the second big idea of peaceful parenting, there are three. The second big idea is a real focus on connection and on the relationship. So really our only true influence over another person is through our relationship with them. Temporarily, you can try to control somebody's behavior by rewards or punishments, but they're problematic for a lot of reasons. And in the end, they don't work. What the research shows, I mentioned Alfie Kohn earlier. If anyone's interested in the research, his book Unconditional Parenting has a ton of research in it in terms of what he's put together from what the studies are about behaviorism, which is what, behaviorism is using rewards or punishments to try to shape someone's behavior. And it can work in the short term, but what the research shows is that in the long term, it doesn't change anyone's behavior. There's so many problems with punishment. I think some of my big ones are it hurts the relationship, which I'm going to come back to in a second, but it also teaches kids what's in it for me. I won't do this thing because I don't want to get caught and I don't want to get punished. Not I won't hit my brother because I don't want to hurt my brother. Like instead, it's I won't hit my brother when my mom is looking and I might get my iPad.
Yeah, they learn
So
how to hide that better.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And punishment really, especially as kids get older, really turns kids into better liars and sneakier. And you might think, okay, my kid makes a mistake and they try to hide it. Not a huge deal when it's like a broken vase or something like that. But as they get older, if they make a mistake sneaking out and going to a party when they weren't supposed to, and then they need help later, but they don't want to call you because they don't want to get in trouble, right? So it really, as kids get older, the risks are bigger, and you really want your kids to be the first one that you come to when they have a problem rather than try to hide their problems from you, right? And punishment really just teaches kids don't let anyone know your problem because you'll get in trouble.
And also for younger kids, I think that when we use punishment, they feel they pay for their misbehavior and they're free to repeat the misbehavior again
Right.
because they pay by being
Yeah,
punished.
no, I love that point, right? Okay, I really want to do this thing, and if I miss iPad for the day, fine, because I get to do the thing, like that kind of idea. Yeah, well, that makes sense too. So we, rather than using punishment and rewards to influence children, we use our relationship and connection and not use it like we're manipulating them, but really everything we do, we ask ourselves like at what cost to the relationship, especially as kids get older. My son that I mentioned to you before we started recording, my son who's traveling backpacking in Europe right now, who's 24, when he was around 16, when he was in high school, he said, Mom, so many of my friends just don't tell their parents where they're going and they ignore their parents' calls when they call them, and they'd even go home at night. And he said, like, unhappily, he said, "You're really lucky that I care what you and dad think." Right? Which is
I love
so
that.
true. I know, I loved it too. And when he said that, I was like, oh my gosh, like that is the crux of it, right? When you have teenagers who care what you think, that is so much of raising teenagers. So we really try to focus on the relationship. Kids who are connected definitely can be more cooperative. It's not a magic wand, but it also does help when you have a good connection with your child. It does help things to run more smoothly. And I will not say that if your child is defiant, it means that you don't have a good connection, because sometimes kids are defiant for lots of other reasons other than they're not connected to you. If you look at everything as a whole, having a good connection does tend to make kids more cooperative.
Yeah. And then the third one, the third
So the
idea.
third big idea is, so I will tell you that since I started doing this, my thoughts on this third big idea have shifted a lot. So what we used to say is kind, firm limits without punishment. We have really moved away from talking about limits, because what I find is that what I always meant as limits were basically health and safety limits. And in my mind, I think of, before you even set a limit, you think, how can I say yes to this? Or how can I be flexible? How can I give my child more autonomy? Is this limit necessary? There's this whole, before you get to kind, firm limits, there's a whole thought process that goes on for me and for that I would encourage people who I work with to follow, which is, this really a necessary limit? But what I was starting to find more and more is that parents were using the idea of kind, firm limits to just still control their kids.
In a
Like,
kinder
well,
way.
exactly. I'm going to still insist that you do it my way or in the order that I think or whatever. I'm just going to be really nice about it. So we've stopped talking about limits in that same way. This is just a shift we made a few months ago. And I just mentioned it because I think it is an interesting thing to think about, is that peaceful parenting isn't about just being nicer in how you control kids. It's really about rethinking the whole relationship between children. And of course, they're not our equals because we've had so much more life experience. Our brains are much more developed than theirs are. So it's not, hey, yeah, you're just my roommate, do whatever you want. We still need to be the guides. We still do need to set health and safety expectations, but there are equals in terms of we try to take their preferences and their ideas seriously as we would another person, who a partner or a friend or whatever. So we always try and think of the third idea, instead of kind, firm limits, we think of collaboration. So the third big idea of peaceful parenting, as we're calling it now, is collaboration. So how can we work together so that everyone's needs can get met at least most of the time?
Okay, how would that work with a younger child?
Give me an example.
Toddlers, 3-year-olds are right now, have a lot of moms asking, they're wondering if they're being permissive by letting their child get whatever they want, because they're using tears and being really annoying, seeking a lot of attention until they get what they want. How do we negotiate with a younger child?
So I will first of all say that when you carefully think about what your limits are, when you carefully think about, is this necessary, reasonable? Can I find a way to make this work? And if you decide like really no, then if your child is upset about that, it's still important to stay firm and just welcome the tears and support them through the emotion, right? If you do change your mind and go against something that is your values or something that okay, let's use an example of, you're going to the toy store to buy a present for the cousin's birthday. And ideally you leave the 3-year-old at home, but say you can't do that. You have to bring the 3-year-old and go to the toy store, and you say, when we go in, we're only going to buy a present for Sally or whatever. We're not going to buy anything for you today, unless of course they have their own money, and then they can bring their own money and buy themselves something. But then they have a giant fit in the toy store and you really are a bit short on money, and that's not something that you're choosing to spend money on to buy them a random present on a Tuesday, but you go against your better judgment and buy them a present anyways because you can't handle their crying. That's what I would call permissive. Is permissive isn't being flexible. Permissive is when you go against your own better judgment because you can't handle your child's feelings and you're just like, I'm just washing my hands of it. Like, I give up. It's a giving up and giving in to a child because you can't handle their feelings, not because you're trying to be flexible or collaborative. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. And so if you say you are going to the toy store with your 3-year-old and they have the little money in their piggy bank, they can bring that along. Or you have like, you can choose something for $5 or some small amount of money, or you really aren't going to buy anything for today. And even if you are sticking with you're not buying anything today, there's so many things you can do. Like a lot of kids like it if you just take a picture of the thing that they want and then you're like, well, put it on your birthday list or your Christmas list. Or I remember when my kids were little, I would let them carry the thing around the store and then say, okay, you can hold it, and then before we leave, we're going to put it back. And that often was satisfying for them too. So even within the no, there are still ways to be supportive of a child and their wishes. And so that's what I mean about collaboration, right? It's not just, this is my way, you better not cry. I told you before we went in that we're not getting a toy, and that's it.
Yeah, awesome. And even with older kids, because I have an 11-year-old daughter who has been asking for an iPhone for over a
Mhm.
year and a half now because all her friends have one. And I've been using a similar approach, like fantasizing what it'd be like when
Yeah,
she gets an iPhone, just looking at cases, what apps she might download
yeah.
when she has one. And that's enough for now.
That's the technique you said, fantasizing, and that's the technique we call giving them their wish and fantasy, which I absolutely love, and it does work, right? For your listeners, the research shows that giving someone their wish and fantasy is actually like they put people in an MRI machine and looked at the parts of their brain that lit up when they were eating ice cream. I don't know how you eat ice cream in an MRI machine, but anyhow, they looked at the parts of their brain when they were eating ice cream versus just thinking about eating ice cream, and the same parts of the brain light up when you're, whether you have an iPhone or you're just thinking about what kind of iPhone you're going to get when you get one. So there is like it does scratch an itch, right? So I love that.
That's so interesting.
So
And
collaboration, you said it is hard when you've got a small child who doesn't have very much sense, and there's a lot that they want. And something you said before made me think about when you said moms feel like they're being permissive. There's a lot that 3-year-olds have absolutely zero control over, right? They don't get to decide 90% of their day. And so I think erring on the side of being flexible, like being really flexible, there's still a long ways to go before you get into the too flexible territory. And if you stop and think about, okay, so your 3-year-old is, you get them breakfast cereal and you pour the cereal and they're like, I didn't want that bowl. I wanted the other bowl. I would change bowls if you could. Like, I have my favorite mug here that I always drink my tea out of. And if it's available, I always will choose that mug because it's my favorite mug. And some people would be like, well, I already poured the cereal. I don't want to be permissive and change it. But when you stop and think about like how many other things are impossible to change for a kid, that they just have to suck it up because they're 3 and they don't get to decide when they go to school or daycare, when they go to bed, generally what they eat, like what their days are structured. There's so much built in that they don't get to decide, that I think whenever we can be flexible and collaborative about, oh, you didn't want that bowl? Okay, the other one's right here. I'll just pour it in. You're not in dangerous waters there.
that's a great point. Really great point.
Yeah.
And
So
we have to
looking
be willing
like,
to be more uncomfortable with some things, right?
and I always think too, like, so anyways, when you're looking at the big picture, is it really like a big deal to change the cereal bowl? Because most of the things the kid doesn't have any control over. So what can you give them control over? And then the other thing is, if you have a child that experiences you throughout their growing up as being willing to make changes like that, being willing to listen to them, being willing to try to accommodate their preferences whenever possible, you're putting deposits into the goodwill bank. So the goodwill bank is like your child is experiencing you over the course of their childhood. And of course, we all have our moments. So nobody's trying to be perfect. And there are days where you're just like, you've had it up to here and changing the cereal bowl is going to be too much. Okay, fine. But in general, if you can really think about how can I be really trustworthy, not being controlling, like I talked about, not being arbitrary, like one day yes, another day no, you're really putting those deposits in the goodwill bank. And when your goodwill bank is nice and beefy, it's much easier to hear a no when it's a no, even if the child doesn't understand. Their experience of you is so trustworthy from the past that they're like, even if I'm unhappy about this, my experience of my mom is that she generally tries to make it work out for me. So I can accept this more easily than if I'm always hearing no and I'm always being controlled. So it's like a long-term approach.
Yeah, and it makes life easier because it's not always a battle of wills and
Yeah,
not a
yeah.
constant struggle because there are so many parents that feel completely overwhelmed and they just try to get through the day. But that's not what it's all about, right? Some people that are further along the journey say that these are your best years when the kids are young and enjoy them
Yeah.
while you can.
Yeah.
But
No,
when you're in the thick of it, it's hard to see that.
yeah. And when my kids were little, and I definitely felt that, one day I realized I heard this really dramatic story on the radio about this woman who she had been like at a gas station with her kids getting gas, petrol, as you might say. And as they pulled away, they got half block away and the gas station blew up. Like there was some sort of gas leak or something and it blew up. And she was like, oh my gosh, if I had been there, if I had been like 1 minute later getting gas, we could have, lost our lives. I heard that and I thought, oh my gosh, like you never know. This sounds cheesy, but you never know when what day will be your last day, right? Like something you could get hit by a bus. And I realized I had been living my life like when the kids start sleeping through the night, when they're in school, when we have more
Mm.
money, all of these future goals of then I'll be happier, then things will be easier. And I realized that in those years that you're talking about, it is really hard. It's really hard. And it's really important to try to find small things every day that you can appreciate because otherwise you're just living for the future. And then one day you'll be like, oh my gosh, they're growing up and I didn't appreciate when they were little. So I'm not trying to downplay how hard it is, but also I think it's possible to start looking for things that you can appreciate. And if you're really, have a lot on your plate, are there things you can let go of? Are there things that you can say no to? Making simpler meals is something that a lot of people it's hard for them because they want to make something not fancy, but like they want to make something more complicated. And sometimes it's just like kids would be happy with spaghetti and spaghetti sauce from a jar every night with apples.
Yeah. And
There's
I
so
also
many
like
things.
to look at it as seasons of life. Right now, it could be a few months that we are in a season that we cannot focus on healthy meals or we cannot be that strict with bedtime or whatever. It's going to change anyway, so don't stress about it.
Yeah, yeah. My mother-in-law told me when my first child was born, she said, don't worry, when things are going really poorly, they will improve. And also when things are going well, they'll get worse.
Yeah, that's true as well.
So
Okay.
things that change is the only constant, right?
And I would love to talk about your article, Don't Try to Make Your Child Feel Better.
Okay.
And you talk how it's important to let kids fully experience their emotions instead of rushing in to fix them. Because I know a
Mhm.
lot of parents are uncomfortable. They try to soothe the child really fast. What's your take on that?
Yeah. So interestingly, what I've come to realize is that so you might say trying to fix it like, okay, I'll buy the toy, giving in to your child after you've very carefully decided that this is a limit worth holding, right? Giving in because you can't handle your child being upset. And then there's also what seems like the polar opposite response of parents who can be very harsh. Stop crying, that old fashioned, stop crying or I'll give you something to cry about. Or if you don't stop crying right now, we're leaving. That very harsh response, right? So you've got the kind of soft and permissive response of, okay, I'll fix it for you. And then the more harsh of, stop crying. Those are both the same thing in a lot of ways. Those are both ways that parents say they're opposite sides of the same coin. They're both ways that parents say, stop feeling. Don't feel this way. Either your feelings are an emergency and I'm going to do whatever I can to fix it, or your feelings are an emergency and I'm going to do whatever I can to shut them down. So both of them are the opposite of what we ideally like to think of as what we call in peaceful parenting welcoming feelings. So welcoming feelings is trying to find empathy. Empathy is easy if you agree. So if your kid comes home and they're like, I didn't get an invitation to the birthday party and everybody else in the class did, you can think, oh my gosh, I would feel terrible if that happened. Like it's really easy to empathize with something like that. But say I don't know, you said you have an 11-year-old. Say your 11-year-old is melting down because the jeans she wanted to wear are wet in the dryer and it's time to leave for school. It would be harder as a parent to empathize with that. Like, just wear a different pair of pants. What's the big deal? But we have to remember that empathy is even more important when we don't agree. It's even more important to try to get there and to try to see it from in my mind the thing that could happen with an 11-year-old and their jeans is they really want to feel like they belong and this is the only pair that is like cool, that their coolest pair of jeans, and something important is happening that day and they really wanted to feel extra confident. And to us as an adult that seem silly, but we have to try to understand that it's important to them, right? Like it might not be important to us, but it's important to them. Or if the classic 3-year-old, you cut my sandwich wrong, or that you peeled a banana when I wanted to. It's really hard sometimes to empathize over those small things, but that's the first thing that you really want to do is like when your child is upset, really try to see it from their point of view and understand. And then some kids like you to say things when they're upset. So other kids will say, shut up and stop talking. So really your individual child, like what feels supportive to them? Is it you just being quiet and sitting next to them while they're upset? Is it you hugging them or giving them some kind of physical touch when they're upset? Is it you saying something like, oh, this is so hard. You really wanted to wear those jeans today. I get it. Whatever,
But stay
welcome.
present with them, right? Not
Yeah,
just
just staying with
leave.
them. And there are some kids who will say, go away. And earlier in my experience in my training, I was taught don't leave a child even if they're telling you to go away. But I've reconsidered that over the past couple of years because it feels a little disrespectful to me if a child's saying go away. Imagine if you were upset and you just wanted to be alone and whoever was with you was like, no, I'm not leaving you alone. That would feel disrespectful. So I like to split the difference and say, okay, I'm going to go over here and I'm going to check in on you in a minute and see how you're feeling. So if the child's saying go away, say, okay, and I'll be right back to check on you and see how you're feeling. And you can go away for 1 minute or you can go to the other side. Okay, I'm going to go sit over here on the chair. So you're still even in the same room as they are, but you're not leaving them
In their
totally alone.
space. Yeah,
Yeah.
okay. I love the middle ground. Yeah,
Yeah. Because I think
awesome.
most kids, while they don't want you to completely leave them alone, okay, fine. And then you're like, come downstairs when you're ready. That might feel really abandoning, but also not listening when someone's saying, go away and leave me alone. I think that could feel disrespectful.
Yeah, but also they need us most when it doesn't look like that. So are they really trying to connect, but they don't know how to express that?
Mm-hmm.
That's a thing I've been having with my 11-year-old. Sometimes she's so independent, but yet I think she's struggling underneath.
Yeah, with an 11-year-old, you can talk about it and you can say, you know how you were telling me when you were upset this morning, you were telling me to go away. Did you really want me to go away? With a child that you can talk to, you can ask them about it and say, I really want to support you in the best way that it seemed like maybe you didn't want me to go away, but I'm just checking in with you.
Yeah, it's important to talk about it after that because otherwise the same patterns keep repeating if you don't address the behavior,
Hmm.
even with peaceful parenting. Or
Yeah. Yeah.
do you have a different approach how to teach life skills?
In terms of peaceful parenting,
Yeah.
that I think there are lots of parents who do this, whether it's peace. I think you could have a lot of parents who are conventional parenting who do what I'm about to say. So I don't think it's like necessarily only peaceful parenting. But I think the best thing you can do to teach life skills is to really give your child as much autonomy as possible and let them. I don't know if you're familiar with the book Hunt, Gather, Parent. She was on my podcast quite a while, maybe 2 years ago, but she went with her daughter, her like 2 or 3 year old daughter at the time, and she lived with a bunch of different cultures. She lived with the Inuit in the north of Canada. She lived with some Mayan people in Mexico, and she also lived somewhere in Africa. And she observed how differently they are with their children than we are in some of our Western democratic cultures. And one thing she noticed is that they let their children participate way more at early ages, even when they're not doing it right, quote, doing it
Mm,
right. So it might be that you save folding the laundry until your toddler is asleep, because you know that they're going to mess up the piles or do it in a annoying fashion. But if you don't actually let them participate, even if it means that it's not done exactly how you want it to be done, they lose that drive to help, right? And then when you
right.
actually want them to help, they're like, why would I help? This is a grown-up's job. This is your job to do all of this stuff. So in terms of life skills, like one of the best things that you can do is really let your kids participate in a real way when they're young.
And be patient because I
Yeah,
think that's what we struggle with because we are so much in a hurry. All day long, we are in a hurry and we don't have the time to just patiently wait for them to
yeah.
finish the task.
Her strategy, which really interesting, is she dropped out the author of the book, Michaeline Duclef. She dropped out kid activities, so they stopped going to the science center or the things that were purely kid focused. And she said if it was a birthday party that I didn't want to go to, we didn't go. But she thought of it as enveloping her child in her life and involving her child in a real way in adult life. Almost like if you think of like in the 1900s, if a family had a store, like the kids would be around in the store and helping out and like at the mom or dad's feet while they're like doing things with the cash register. The parents aren't saying, okay, we've got to spend 3 hours going to the water park. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with water parks or science centers, but do you know what I'm saying?
It's not
A
everything
person,
is not kid centered, right?
yes.
Mhm.
As a person could be forgiven for thinking that you said it takes a lot of patience to be like that with a child. Well, how are you going to fit that in with everything else? Something has to go, right? So maybe you decide to involve your child more in your own life and letting them participate more, and you don't do as much kid-centered stuff.
That's a good point.
Mhm.
Sarah,
Sure.
this has been such a joy talking to you.
Oh,
Before we wrap up, can you let listeners know where they can connect with you?
sure. So reimaginepeacefulparenting.com is our website. All the information is there for coaching. My podcast is linked there. You can get the Peaceful Parenting podcast wherever you get podcasts. We have a Facebook group that's a really great support group, Reimagine Peaceful Parenting on Facebook. I also have a membership, which is a low cost monthly subscription where you get access to me for office hours. But everything that you can possibly find is on reimaginepeacefulparenting.com.